To mark International Podcast Day, we at FundCalibre decided to take a look over the last 5 months of our Investing on the Go podcast and share with you some of our favourite moments.
On one of our most recent podcasts, I had the pleasure of meeting Martin Lau, manager of the First State Asia Greater China Fund. Martin and his team are based primarily in Hong Kong and Singapore, but every time he comes to London, he comes and pays us a visit, or we go into town to see him. And we were able to have a really nice conversation about the Chinese-US trade tensions, but how it looks from China and Hong Kong, not just a Western view of that. And I just thought that was A, of real interest, but B, it highlighted how privileged we are and lucky to get to meet some of the best managers in the world.
My favourite podcast has to be the first one that we did with James Thomson. There aren't many fund managers I'd ask to be a guinea pig, let alone doing it just before they're sitting down to an investment dinner with loads of journalists. We were literally sitting at a table while there were waiters around us, putting out the cutlery, putting out the water, etc. And he was just brilliant. He's got a way of making investing sound really interesting. And the things that he invests in are things that we all know about, like Amazon, online dating, investing in Tinder. It's brilliant the way that he talks about that.
So I'm going to go with Polar Healthcare Trust, the podcast with James Douglas. For anyone who follows US politics, which I do quite a bit, it's about the only politics managed to trump ours in terms of twists and turns. It's a very topical issue. I really liked hearing about how investors go about navigating this minefield, especially from a specialist in the field like James. So much of the fund depends on the US. It's really nice to hear how he goes about dealing with all this news and then also comparing the news that you hear with the investment story. He also talks about the limited life of a fund. It's quite a rare structure and investors can get a little put off by it, so it's nice to hear how he's explained it in a very clear way. It gets us really reassured with the story.
My favourite has been Tom Slater from Scottish Mortgage. I loved that podcast. Often when we talk about Scottish Mortgage, we talk about things like Amazon and Netflix, even Tesla. A lot of it revolves around technology and big names and things that we've all heard of. And I'm guilty of myself when I write about them in the Millennial series. So I thought it was really interesting to hear about how healthcare is in their portfolio, but also how healthcare has this innovative technology aspect that goes along with the portfolio and how it works. From blood delivery in sub-Saharan Africa to genetic sequencing. I thought it was fascinating, and I've made everybody listen to it at least twice, so it by far is my favourite episode so far.
I really enjoyed the podcast with John Bennett. He's been investing in Europe for over 30 years, and he talked about how he first started getting into investing when he was very young. I think it's really important that we educate young people and get them thinking about investing earlier, and that really came through in John's podcast. And even though he's been investing for 30 years, he's still making tweaks to his process many years later. I think it was a really interesting listen.
Apparently, I'm in a minority of 22% of people who like to listen to podcasts on their commute. 49% it appears like to listen at home, which brings me on nicely to TM Home Investor Fund, which is another of my favourite podcasts. And funnily enough, I drive past some of the properties that he owns every time I go down to see my mum and dad. So it's really good talking to him and finding out why he picked that particular area, why he decides to actually invest where he does. The other thing that I really like about it is he does this thing called his daughter test. Basically, he will go to an area in the UK, whether it's Leeds, Manchester, Horsham, doesn't matter where, and he will walk around late at night in the area where he wants to actually buy a property. And if he thinks that he'd be happy for his own daughter to live there, that she'd be safe, he'll go ahead and buy. That's the type of analysis that I really want a fund manager to be doing before they actually invest in something on my behalf.
I really like the Investec UK Special Situations and the Cautious Managed Fund with Alistair Mundy. It's cheating a little bit using a podcast that I did, but he's a fantastic speaker and he's always really interesting to listen to, whether on mic or just in a meeting. He's a contrarian investor, which means he is very different to how other people invest, and his style's been severely out of favour for quite a while. Therefore, having a meeting with him is challenging for him, but it's really interesting to do as an interviewer. He defends his style very, very well, especially some of his bigger calls. He's got, at the time he had 9% of his fund in gold and silver miners. something you don't normally hear. So him talking about that with such a bold call is really interesting, and it's very much paid off of late as well. He also talks about a few out-of-favour stocks, so things like M&S and Tesco. It's really interesting to hear the stories behind these companies that we know so well from an investor point of view. They're very recognisable, so seeing how they behave on the high street, how you hear about them in the news, then how an investor talks about them, is a really nice contrast.
For my first podcast, I met with Mark Sherlock, who is the fund manager of the Hermes US SMID Cap Fund. I actually found it really interesting. Firstly, he had a background from an educational perspective in politics, and whilst he has moved into a completely different sphere for his career, the fact that he looked for long-term performance from stocks, from what he hoped that politicians should be looking for when making policy, I found quite interesting. We talked about a couple of stocks with Mark, and some stocks that may resonate with UK investors. Latterly, a stock which he talked about was Aptar. Again, a diversified business, but the bit that really caught my attention was the fact that it makes dispensing mechanisms for liquids like shampoo, so the actual part of the shampoo container that dispenses into your hand. But one of the environmental things, and Hermes has always been a big investor in ESG, it's always been a part of their process and their thinking, is that this business is designing a lid for bottles that actually stays attached to the bottle. A staggering statistic that 7 billion bottles are opened every day on the planet and only 1 billion are actually recycled. The really big pollutant, and we know plastic is a pollutant, but it's actually the lids of the bottles. So that's 6 billion lids of bottles a day, and the company that they are investing in is designing and producing a lid that is attached to the bottle, which will make it far less pollutant and should lead to far greater recycling. So I thought that was of real interest in the podcast I did with Mark.
So one of the podcasts I really liked was with Sacco Hardy, the fund manager for AXA Framington Japan. She talked about Japan's place in the world and how it had changed over the years. For example, after when the Berlin Wall collapsed, that coincided actually with the market collapsing, and I think she had some really interesting things to say on that.
Income is a really popular theme with our investors, and a fund that I really like that's slightly different in this space is VT Gravis UK Infrastructure Income Fund. I did a podcast with investment advisor Bri Largent, and it was one of my favourite because during the podcast you can almost see him start to relax the more we start talking. And it was right at the very end when we kind of finished the main questions that we were going to discuss, and we were just chatting generally, and he actually sat back, relaxed, and then just started talking to me about the weather in the UK, how unpredictable it is and how it makes it difficult to store renewable energy. The fact that while electric vehicles are becoming really popular, even the government's trying to get us to use them in London, actually the infrastructure's just not in place yet. I learnt so much in those final few minutes that I really liked that.
We hope you enjoyed our favourite moments. We sure have. And if you want to learn more about these funds, listen to the episodes in full, please go to FundCalibre.com, and don't forget to subscribe to our Investing on the Go podcast, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and SoundCloud. Thanks for watching.